thank you so much for being with us on the second day of AIUK. My name is Irene Magliaraki, and I'm a project development manager at the Alan Turing Institute. I see we have hundreds of you in the audience, so we are really pleased to be able to convene this kind of audience today and speak about climate change. So today we will hear from leading environmental scientists who are monitoring and predicting climate change using new AI methods to measure and observe changes in ecosystems. Just a few housekeeping matters. Please leave your questions on Slido. This is on the right side of your screen. You can also vote on those questions. So the most popular ones will be at the top, and I will ask those to our panelists. Also, please follow the conversation online. You can tag the Turing in your social media posts, and our Turing handle is @TuringInst, and the hashtag for the event is #AIUK. So just to very quickly set our stage for the conversation, in the last decade in particular, we've seen a deluge of environmental data that have become available. These include remote sensing data, satellite data, or citizen science observation. That data combined with advances in AI and machine learning have now revolutionized how we do Earth system science. For example, new AI methods have been used to improve weather and climate predictions, post-process model outputs, extract information from data across space and time, and also improve the computational efficiency of our climate models. This growing infrastructure of sensors and learning algorithms really has the potential to put us on a more sustainable path. For this to happen, citizens, governments, academia, and the private sector need to collect, share, and process data. But we also need a lot more than that. We need better capabilities and methods in data fusion, modeling, analysis, a better understanding of the interdependencies and tipping points, as well as the ability to make timely predictions about the state of environmental health. So these are some of the topics that we will visit today. And just to give you an idea of what to expect, I'll take a few moments to briefly introduce our panelists. Then we'll hear the talks of our speakers. This panel in particular demonstrates how well the Turing can break down disciplinary silos. So we will triangulate the topic using 3 lenses. Scott Hosking will give us the climate science perspective and tell us about the use of AI to understand climate change impacts in the Arctic. Gavin Sadik will bring the environmental intelligence perspective and tell us about modeling complex interactions between climate change and a variety of other ecosystems. And last but not least, Lyons will bring the ecological perspective and tell us about climate change impacts on European forests. After the presentations, we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. I'll kick off the conversation asking 1 or 2 questions to draw out some high-level themes. And very, very quickly after that, I will open the floor to your questions. So please don't forget to send us your questions on Slido. So yeah, let's get started with panel introduction. So our first panelist for today is Dr. Scott Hosking. Scott is an environmental data scientist at the British Antarctic Survey, where he's leading the AI lab. He's a co-director of the UKRI Centre for Doctoral Training in the application of AI for the study of environmental risks at the University of Cambridge and Bath, as well as a senior research fellow at the Alan Turing Institute. Welcome, Scott, and the stage is yours.
Fantastic, Irene. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's great to be here. So I'm going to be talking about a project that I've been leading for the last 18 months at the British Antarctic Survey. And more recently, as I joined the Turing just a year ago at the start of lockdown, this is a project that sits between the 2 institutes, and it's a fantastic and really exciting piece of work. So why is sea ice important? So sea ice acts like a mirror, reflecting sunlight back into space. If that sea ice melts, then we expose the dark ocean surface beneath, and that darker ocean can absorb more solar radiation and heat up. So it's really important that we have a sea ice and we're able to predict and to understand sea ice. As salt water, as the ocean water freezes, that rejects salt into the ocean, and this rejection of salt drives the thermohaline circulation. This is the global ocean currents that redistributes heat around our planet. And sea ice is hugely important also for supporting native people, wildlife, their fishing, hunting, and migration activities. Also, sea ice is hugely important in the Arctic, the polar regions. Both of them are important for influencing weather over mid-latitudes. And only last month did we see temperatures in Texas and over large parts of Europe, plummet down to levels that are, very unusual for this time of year, especially for these, places which are quite far south, near which usually experience much nicer, warmer climates. So what are the aims of this project? We want to build an AI that can do seasonal sea ice forecasts, predicting up to 6 months ahead. We also want to build an AI that can could quantify uncertainty, so it can tell us when we're doing a good job or when the AI is less certain, and we need that in order to make and to base our decisions on. And then also, machine learning should not be a black box. If we are to trust these tools, we need to be able to know what they're doing. So we want to be able to use deep learning AI to help us understand the physical processes. We want to open up the black box and see what's inside. So the Arctic is highly complex. Temperatures have been going up, as we know, for the last 40 years. This is the the graph on the left here. And on the right, we see sea ice extent going down. Now, we know they are that both of them are linked to one another, but actually it's more complicated than that. So they're not exactly anti-correlated. So if we see a peak in temperature in one year, that doesn't necessarily correlate or correspond to a dip in sea ice extent. There's a lot more information and climate and environmental signals that are coming into play. So we got together, we reached out to the community, we met with sea ice physicists, oceanographers, climate scientists, Earth observation scientists, and we put together a lot of gridded data that we felt would be important if we're to make these predictions in sea ice. So sea ice itself, temperatures in the atmosphere, sea surface temperatures, pressure and winds. And as we're interested in predicting seasonal scale, then we are interested in a time frequency of around a month. We don't really care about for this particular problem, the daily frequency. That would provide a lot of noise and make the AI a much bigger task. So we focused initially on monthly data. But the problem here is that we only have 500 of months from the real world. We've only got, the satellite era only covers 1979 to the present. And 500 months is nowhere near enough for a lot of deep learning problems. So we borrowed model data from climate model simulations. So climate simulations ran for a lot longer, from 1850 to the end of the century to 2100. So that provides us with information on very different climate regimes. There's over 40 of these different climate models. They can run for a number of ensembles. So we have a much bigger data set to play with. So we need to now find a way to bring this climate model simulation data world together with the real world observation. How do we blend these two together? And this is our new tool called IceNet, which is a UNet deep learning architecture. Just to walk you through what this does. So on the left-hand side here, we are feeding information into the neural network. So we feed in these weather variables I just mentioned. We are then extracting information from these images and downsampling by taking convolutions. And it's called a UNet because you see that we are downsampling down to a size of 27 by 27 pixels before we then upsample back to the original resolution. We pre-train this model by running the climate simulation data through it first. So we have over 2,000 years of climate model output. And what this does, it gets the neural network into a sensible state. So if temperatures go up, then sea ice concentration should go down. If the winds are blowing towards the east, then we would expect some of the ice to move towards the east. So the network is able to capture some of those basic concepts. And then we fine tune, using a transfer learning approach, we fine tune this IceNet neural network with satellite observations. So the output is our monthly average sea ice maps for 1, 2, 3, up to 6 months ahead. And we run this as an ensemble. So what we do is we run the same architecture 25 times. And this provides us with a measure of uncertainty. So we know how confident we can be in those results. Okay, so a little more detail before we jump into something a little more fun. These are the output classes for the model. So this is what the model is actually producing. It produces a probability that a given grid cell has no ice, a probability that has marginal ice, so that's ice between 15 and 80%, and full ice, where ice is above 80%. And I show here the training and validation and testing that we employed. So with those in mind, I'm now going to show you a little animation, and this is a game of spot the difference. One of these is our AI, and one of them is the satellite product. So let's start that now. And you can see that as we step through the year, so we're now in April, May, and we should now see the sea ice starting to shrink as we go into the summer months. And you can see that both of them are doing the same thing. It's, there's not a huge amount of difference between them. There's some important features, like there's this tongue of sea ice here, which is captured in both. And as we approach the end of the year, now you can see that the one on the left is our AI, it's IceNet. And that now I've added a black contour around the outside, which indicates the observed edge. So you can now compare this complex edge between the AI and the real world. And you can see we're doing a great job. We're really capturing those important features, which would be hugely important for polar bear migrations, or the peoples that live there that need to fish and hunt to sustain themselves. Okay, so let's drill into some of the numbers now. IceNet and how it compares to some other models. The blue line here is our IceNet predicting up to 6 months lead time. So that 6 months is, let's say we want to predict September this year, 2021. That if we want to predict that 6 months ahead, that would be like predicting it with all the data that we have today. So we're in March at the moment. So we know the state of the atmosphere, we know the state of the sea ice. Can we bring all that together and use that to predict 6 months ahead? That's what we're trying to do with a 6 month lead time prediction. And we're comparing that blue line at IceNet with the state of the art physics-based model. And that you can see from 2 months lead time and beyond, we are outperforming that state of the art physics-based model. The other great thing with this approach is once it's trained, you can run this on a laptop. It only takes 10 seconds. So we could deploy this beyond without needing the large HPC computing facilities that many of these physics-based models need. Let's drill in again into this a bit more detail. So you've seen this plot on the top left here. I've now added the linear trend. So that's just a simple benchmark. And you can see again where it's performing that simple benchmark. And I've also added a heat map at the bottom left there. So this is if we produced a perfect forecast, that we would have to see 100% accuracy. So everything is below 100%, but we see some structure. So for instance, in September, a 6 month lead time, we can see that these darker black colors. So we're not performing as well at that time of year. And that's that's a crucial time, because that's the minimum in Arctic sea ice. So we really want to be capturing that. But if you compare to our physics-based model, you can actually see our improvement is around 2 to 3% better than the physics-based model. So we're able to capture this really difficult time of year to make predictions this September, where sea ice is at its minimum. So where can I mentioned there where IceNet can be improved in time, by season, and now we want to look at where IceNet could be improved spatially. So the orange areas here are where the AI has made an error, and here's some examples for 3 months in 2020. And this gives us some idea of where we need more information. Where can we extract more information from satellite or take more information from, say, the ground? And that's exactly what we're doing next. So in IceNet now, we want to use that and bolt it together with an AI for strategic fleet management to understand where we need to make more measurements and where do we need to send those drones in, the underwater drones or the air drones, to make and take more measurements for us. So we've just got a new professor starting at the British Antarctic Survey. It's going to be leading this effort in April. Another project that is just spinning up now is building an AI that can blend this gridded data that we've been talking about, the satellite data, with non-gridded irregular data. So data from submarines or weather stations or sensors that move around. Again, that project is just starting in April. So it's really exciting to be able to bring all these things together. So lastly, just to what's next for environmental AI, and I know that some of my other panelists will mention this. We need open and reproducible data pipelines. We are supporting the Pangeo effort. We're working closely with Microsoft AI for Earth to do that. And please get in touch, and you can find details on our website if you'd like to get involved. These tools underpin all environmental science. And if we can build this common framework, that can really help so many areas. Physics-informed AI is clearly something that we need to jump into, and this is something we're starting to think about, and growing an open and inclusive community. And we need to bring the environmental AI community together and really help them understand each other's language, the way they think. This is really an area that I'm really excited to be helping and pushing. So lastly, thank you for everyone for coming. Here's our sponsors and people who have collaborated on this project. Tom Anderson is the magic man. You can find his link in the bottom left there. Please get in touch with him. And I've added a QR code for our preprint. And back to Irini. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. This is really impressive. So please send us your questions for Scott on Slido. And coming up next is Professor Gavin Sadik. Professor Sadik is the chair of data science and statistics at the University. At the University of Exeter, and co-director of the Joint Center for. Sorry about that. So Professor Sadik is the chair of data science and statistics at the University of Exeter, and co-director of the Joint Center for Excellence in Environmental Intelligence, which is a joint center with the UK Met Office. He's also the director of the UKRI Center for Doctoral Training in Environmental Intelligence at the University of Exeter, and co-lead of the recently established Environment and Sustainability theme at the Alan Turing Institute, where he's also a Turing Fellow. Over to you, Gavin.
Thank you, Irini, and thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm going to follow on from Scott's presentation with a view of how AI and environmental science can come together and look at how we can integrate those with other data sources and other areas of expertise to try to tackle some of the great challenges that face us today in environmental change and climate change. So, as I'm sure we're all aware, our interaction with the natural environment plays a crucial role in all aspects of our society, our health, wealth, safety and future development. And as Irini said in the introduction, there's a kind of unique opportunity at the moment to fully exploit the explosion in data that's available to us, and in environmental data in particular has grown immensely recently, with data from remote satellites, but also ground-based sensors, as Scott mentioned some examples, and some of those sensors are getting increasingly lower cost and will be much more plentiful, but of course they might not be the same level of accuracy as some well-established monitoring networks. And so we need to understand how we can bring this data together and integrate it in a coherent manner so that we can actually produce information that will help decision makers and really give us a chance to a step change in the understanding of the complex interactions between the environment, climate, natural ecosystems, human, social and economic systems. And it's only really by data science and AI, with that volume of data and the complexity of data from these different systems, that we'll be able to bring them together in a holistic manner. So we've defined environmental intelligence as the integration of environment and sustainability research and expertise and data with data science and artificial intelligence, with the aim that if we can bring together data from multiple diverse sources, many of which will have different histories, they'll have different biases, uncertainties, they'll be measured over different spatial scales, as Scott mentioned. Often environmental data is available on gridded data sets, whereas if we have measurements from ground-based monitors or sensors, they'll be at particular point locations in time and space. We need a way of bringing that data together, and also data on other aspects of society, such as populations, economic data, really to bring those together to provide the meaningful insight we need to develop solutions to adaptation and mitigation of environment and climate change. So there are great opportunities if we can do this, I've split these into two main themes on this slide. One is the tracking, monitoring and evaluating interventions. We really develop solutions to these most important of challenges. We're going to have good data. So Adrian Smith talked yesterday morning about the need for good data. Often that data is out of date for decision making, and we've seen how crucial up-to-date accurate data was in the COVID pandemic recently, but also we need disaggregated information. Often we have data at a very high level, but if we're to find solutions that work locally, we're going to need disaggregated data, often at higher resolutions than we are able to naturally kind of obtain. So we would use AI to downscale that data to look at very local conditions. It's also going to be incredibly important in helping us to track progress against the sustainability development goals. It's estimated that of the 93 environment-related SDGs, there is insufficient data to progress for about 68% of them. And I'll show you an example at the end of this presentation on how we've used data science and AI to estimate indicators for air pollution, where there is a wide network of air pollution monitors across the world, but it's largely centered in Western Europe, North America, increasingly China and India, but there are large parts of the world where there just isn't any information. And this kind of data inequalities is something we see quite often. But also there's another arguably more important role for AI in some ways, which is to facilitate change itself by integrating AI and data into energy, transport, agriculture, and other environmentally related systems. So what data do we have? Scott mentioned this combination of gridded data sets for remote sensing satellites. We've also got data recorded at specific points in space and time. Irene mentioned increasing use of citizen science data. So how do we bring these very different data sources together? And we need a way of integrating that data that acknowledges there will be different biases, there'll be different uncertainties. The data often will be measured or collected for completely different reasons. If we're bringing together economic data, population data, demographics, environmental data, mobility data, they're obviously recorded in very different ways for very different reasons. If we're going to bring those together in a coherent fashion, we're going to have to really understand the provenance of the data and the data journey and what effects that might have on the results that we obtain. So I'll now move to some examples. I'll start with the two that Scott has mentioned already. One is the Pangeo platform. The size of some of the environmental data we're talking about is absolutely enormous, and we do need new platforms and new systems to be able to analyze, especially if we're going to integrate it with other data sources as well. And the Pangeo community platform for big data geoscience is a very good example of this, a really kind of next generation way of doing environmental analysis. In the top right hand corner, we can see the project that is kicking off at the Alan Turing Institute at the beginning of April, bridging spatial scales, really developing new methodology and tools to bring together data on gridded data and on point source data and other data in a way that actually is generic across many disciplines. And I think will be a really exciting project, produce some really important results. In the top left-hand corner, we see an example. This is Climber, which is a framework being developed together with the Met Office. And this is for quantifying and visualizing the risk associated with climate change. So considering risks as the combination of three different components, hazard, exposure, and vulnerability, can we bring data together on those three different components to actually come up with a way of quantifying risks associated with climate change? So, for example, urban heat on health or flooding on assets and infrastructure. And in the bottom right-hand corner, an example, again, a new project starting at the Turing in April, the effect of climate change on food security and agriculture. So how can we bring together climate projections with agriculture and crop models, models of crop disease, to better understand the risks to agriculture and food security, and also how that information can be used to develop mitigation strategies. Another example, which I mentioned earlier, is in calculating SDG indicators, Sustainable Development Goal indicators for air pollution. Air pollution is one of the most important risks to health globally, and the WHO estimate each year 4.2 million deaths can be attributable to outdoor or ambient air pollution, and it's estimated that over 90% of the people worldwide are exposed to harmful levels of fine particulate air pollution. That's particles very small, less than 2.5 micrograms in diameter, that go through our natural kind of barriers and affect not just respiratory conditions, but also cardiovascular disease, and increasingly a wider range of adverse health outcomes, including dementia and diabetes. And we can see on the right-hand side, the problem is that the monitoring network in the WHO's ambient air quality database contains a lot of measurements in North America, Western Europe, increasingly China and India. And on the right-hand side, we see the locations of PM 2.5 monitors across the world. Now, there are more monitors across the world, but not a distance that means included in the WHO's database. But we can see large parts, certainly Africa, South America, where there just is little or almost no monitoring information. So how do we estimate exposures to air pollution in those countries and then be able to do assessments of health? How can we inform the governments of those countries how best to tackle air pollution if there's no consistent information? So there's a need for accurate estimates of exposure to air pollution at global, national, and also very local levels. Also, that information needs to be consistent over both space and time. It needs to be resilient in some ways to an influx of new data that might be recorded differently if we're to see whether there is progress and look at trends over time. And an example of AI and data science helping with an environmental SDG problem can be seen in the data integration model for air quality, which was developed by the WHO's Data Integration Task Force. And this is technically, it's a Bayesian hierarchical modeling framework that takes in information from satellites, ground monitors, chemical transport models, numerical simulations from weather models, also land use information, and other factors that might relate to air quality, including population density, and enables us to go from the map on the left with those gray spaces to the map on the right, where we have estimates of air quality everywhere in the world. And actually it predicts on a high resolution grid 0.1 degrees, which is approximately 10 kilometers by 10 kilometers at the equator. And the next version of DMAC, Data Integration Model for Air Quality, actually is looking to do that on a 1K by 1K basis. Crucially, it's not just estimates at each location. We actually get what's known as a full posterior distribution, each of those locations on a high resolution grid. It enables us to look at not just the expected level of air pollution, but also on the uncertainties associated with those estimates. So we can do things like look at uncertainty intervals, but also we can look at probabilities of exceedance. What is the probability that PM 2.5 at a certain location exceeds the WHO air quality limits and interim targets? And that's the basis of SDG indicator 11.6.2, which is annual mean levels of fine particulate matter, PM2.5 and PM10 in cities, population weighted. And by aligning these estimates from DMAC with high resolution population estimates, which are derived from satellite images together with other data, looking at nighttime light, essentially, we can get a population weighted estimate of air pollution, which then we can link to our health burden analysis and finally come up with that number 4.2 million, knowing actually that 4.2 million is an aggregate number over the entire world. We can actually do this for each country and actual sub-regions of each country as well. I'd like to end on a point which Scott brought up, which I think is very important. We are building a community of people who can really make a difference, I think. And that means bringing together experts in AI and data science with experts in environmental science, but also people who understand behavioral science, the economy. And it's really by sharing expertise over different domains that we're really going to make solutions that could really make a difference. And two examples of this at the moment, there's a special interest group at the Alan Turing Institute, and also the Joint Centre for Excellence in Environmental Intelligence has a network. And I would say to everybody, feel free, welcome to contact us and join us in the exciting future of using AI to address some of the most important challenges we face today. Thank you.
Thank you, Gavin. I certainly feel a lot more hopeful about all the possibilities that you just described. So our last speaker is Dr. Emily Lyons. Emily is a lecturer in physical geography at the University of Cambridge. She's also a UKRI Future Leaders Fellow and a Fellow of the Alan Turing Institute. Over to you, Emily.
Can you hear me now? Yes, okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I'm going to follow on from many of Gavin's points and talk in a little bit more detail about some of the challenges that we face in predicting the future of ecosystems, particularly forests. So I'm hoping that people here are aware that forests are really important, but if you don't know too much about them, the terrestrial biosphere as a whole stores around as much carbon as is in the atmosphere and sequesters around 1/3 of our global greenhouse gas emissions. So when we talk about carbon capture and storage, well, the biosphere is currently doing that for us. And many, as countries become more aware of this, and as we get more and more information about forests, more countries want to use them to help them to meet things like the Paris Climate Agreements. So many countries, including many European countries, have written into their national action plans that they'll plant more forests, and they'll sequester more carbon in their existing forests in order to meet these international commitments. But of course, they're not just important for carbon and for climate change. Forests harbour around 80% of terrestrial biodiversity, so 80% of species that live on land live within forests. And around 1 billion people around the world rely on forests in one form or another for their food and fuel. And crucially, around 90% of people living in extreme poverty rely on forests for their livelihoods, or in part at least. So preserving and enhancing forests is not just about climate change, it's also about tackling the 6th mass extinction that we're in, and also reaching sustainable development goals and eradicating extreme poverty. So we're really interested in preserving our forests and enhancing them, but unfortunately we can already see that climate change is changing our forests, and there are observations around the world as to how both changes in average climatic conditions and extreme climatic events are affecting our forests. So for example, we see as winters become warmer that spring phenology is happening earlier, as areas become warmer, species are shifting their ranges and advancing in latitude and altitude. And we're also seeing effects of more extreme events, disturbances like regular droughts and fires are becoming more frequent and more intense. And that creates potential for tipping points and changes that are quite rapid and can be quite catastrophic in our ecosystems. So you can see an example here, an image of a mass drought-induced dieback event in California, where this is an ecosystem that's adapted to a certain amount of drought, but the increase in the regularity and severity of it means that these trees are not able to recover from previous droughts, and we see this mass dieback. So climate change threatens the forest ecosystems that we want to rely on, and in Europe, one study I saw projects that there'll be a 50% decline in the value of forests by the end of this century. So we need to make decisions for forest management now that meet mitigation goals and that will enable us to have resilient forests in the future. So they need to be evidence-based, accurate, robust, and make best use of data. So there are an awful lot of approaches out there to modeling forests, and many of these are not really designed for predictive modeling for this kind of challenge that we face. They range from very small scale to global. There are some that are correlative. There are an awful lot that are hybrid or more process-based. We have large-scale correlative models that look at things like species distributions in relation to climate space. But these are correlative only, so they don't really include any process that would tell us if those species are going to track climate change. Our global models that are coupled with climate models are typically represent vegetation in a pixel as some kind of large blob of photosynthetic material. So they don't have any ecological detail, no information about individual trees that are growing or dying. They're called big leaf models often. And we believe that this individual ecological interaction, individual tree demography is really important for understanding and predicting climate change. There are some models that do that, these individual-based models. They're often parameterized using very localized data, very detailed long-term plot level data, and don't necessarily have the ability to predict into the future. So most forest models are built to understand existing forests and are really not suitable for prediction beyond a few years. Individual-based models, which model individual trees and tell us whether those trees will grow, will reproduce and die, are the ones that will tell us about the long-term persistence and resilience of forests to climate change. So this is a kind of really simplistic structure of what those kinds of models look like. We have individual stems spatially located with species identities and some kind of size, biomass of them that tells us how much carbon is within them. And then the model goes through some annual updates. So we get annual growth, so additional carbon into the system. We get arrival of new stems through recruitment, and we get mortality and loss of carbon through tree death. Some of these models might include some abiotic factors, some climate variability as well. These models are usually parameterized locally. We need information about individual trees, and most often we have good data for tree growth, so it's relatively easy to measure tree growth. You go out with a tape measure around a tree trunk and measure it every few years, and you work out how much it grows. Mortality and recruitment are much harder. Trees very rarely die. They're very, very long-lived things. So in order to observe mortality and to get good data on mortality, you need to track the life of tens of thousands of individual stems over multiple years, which is hugely time intensive and costly to do. So we do have some information about mortality. We have almost no information about large scale recruitment, because when people go out into forests to track them, they don't typically measure saplings and seedlings. And that means that we lose all of that early lifespan information, which really limits our ability to say whether a forest is regenerating or replacing itself. So there's a lot of ecological detail here within models, and a lot of reason to try and simplify some of this to build big predictive models. But we think that this matters for the global carbon cycle, and I have an example here to try to explain that. So we built a simple individual-based model in New Zealand. This is a study I was involved in a few years ago, where we took plot data of individual trees that have been tracked through time, and we parameterize the model just of individual tree growth of a small number of species. And we ask the question, in a warmer and drier New Zealand into the future, will these forests be absorbing more carbon, or will they be releasing carbon? So fundamentally, will they be source carbon sink into the future, which is a critical question. And what we found in the graphs in the bottom right here is that the answer depends on whether or not these species are able to track climate change. So these graphs show on the y-axis the change in biomass production compared to prior to climate change, and the left-hand graph along the temperature gradient, the right-hand along a rainfall gradient. And we simulated a number of different scenarios, because honestly, we don't have always data to tell us which is the most likely scenario. But the black and the blue simulations here show if we keep the composition of New Zealand tree species the same, we just make it warmer, what will happen? And we see an increase in woody production in many places. So we see additional carbon uptake. So that might be a sort of short-term climate change effect. But in the long term, if the species are able to track the changing climate, so this is shown in the green and the red, we expect a decline in biomass uptake in many parts of New Zealand, and this is up to a third of a reduction. So what this tells us is that the lack in data that we have and the lack in model detail is really important for predicting the future of these forests. So why is it that we have this lack? Well, collecting data on individual trees is really time consuming and it's very costly. It's also a lot of fun, I won't lie, but it's definitely a challenge. And listening to people like Scott talk about the size of their data, well, reduce that at several orders of magnitude to get to where we're at with individual tree measurements. The most important forests of the world are very hard to get to. We might take boats or go over quite rough terrain to get to them. We need large teams of people living in the middle of nowhere with an awful, with no creature comforts, without electricity, to go out and take measurements. It's very skilled work to know what species you're looking at within a forest in order to measure it. And we can spend a long time out there doing forest measurements and get relatively small amounts of data. This means that these long-term repeat measurements of trees that are so critical to understand their demography rely on long-term thinking from funders and from national agencies. And unsurprisingly, the data that we have that tell us about how forests work is primarily collected in the global north. And tropical and boreal forests, which are the most important for carbon storage and sequestration, data coverage is exceptionally poor in some of those areas. So individual-based demographic data is one thing that we know that we need in order to predict the future of forests. But right at the start, I showed you a whole range of different observations of how climate change is impacting forests, and different kinds of data inform us about that at different scales. And there's a whole wide range of different types of data that we need that are collected by different types of ecologists and biologists and remote sensing scientists that may be collected with different measurement protocols depending on where you are in the world or what kind of forest you're working on at very different spatial and temporal scales. And these long-term observations that are so valuable often sit with individual research groups or national agencies. And there are some absolutely heroic efforts going on to try and bring these data together, but it's certainly a big problem when we know that we need more information, but that data is not accessible. So how can we move forward and how can we produce these robust predictions that we really need to in order to plan resilient future forests and manage resilient future forests? Well, my opinion is that existing data is vastly underused. This map in the center here of Europe shows a harmonization effort to bring together national inventories. The countries in the darker color were willing to share their data. Many countries do collect these data, but are not necessarily willing to share it. So national agencies must make their monitoring data open and accessible. We also need to increase the use and uptake of Earth observation data within the ecological community. and the interactions between remote sensing communities and ecologists, so that we are interpreting those data with some biological realism behind them. But this is really the only global data that we have in order to inform our models. Really excitingly, there are a number of new methods to monitor individual trees that are coming out of new remote sensing technologies. And this is work going on within my group, where we have new laser scanning methods and drone methods that have the potential to get much more information much more quickly and potentially over larger areas. But we need new processing tools in order to extract out individual tree from these noisy three-dimensional point clouds that we make to get ecologically meaningful features. So the challenges that I see in this field moving forward in order to enable these robust predictions to happen are that we can't just apply correlative approaches as sort of empirical based approaches, because we know that the underlying ecology and biology, those processes are nonlinear, they're interactive, and they are happening at different spatial and temporal scales that influence emergent properties like carbon storage and biomass growth. And ignoring them, I hope I've shown, can create major errors in our interpretation. We have problems with lack of data. There's an awful lot of data out there, but we do have genuine problems of lack of data. And in those places, Bayesian approaches show promise, so hierarchical approaches or approximate Bayesian computation. We also need experimentation because climate change is creating novel climate species combinations that we haven't seen before, and we don't necessarily have a good handle on what those will produce into the future. So we need new approaches to data fusion. We need new processing methods for the kinds of data that we're starting to produce from different types of remote sensing. And we need to rethink model structure to make them flexible to incorporate and assimilate multiple different types of data. And I think that that's where the biggest gains will be within this field. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Emily. Yeah, again, thank you to all the speakers for the thought-provoking presentations, and thanks to the audience for the great questions. I'm afraid we're running a little bit behind schedule, so let's be brief with some of the questions. We have a really good question from Jason Ward, which I think is relevant for climate science and ecology, so perhaps all the speakers can comment on. So the question is, how can we integrate traditional physics-based modeling approaches with bottom-up data-driven techniques such as deep learning? So would you like to comment on that, maybe starting with Scott and moving to the other speakers?
Sorry, Rini, can you just repeat that one?
Yeah, so how can you integrate traditional physics-based modeling approaches? How can you preserve the knowledge we have about the world, the ecological, physical knowledge we have about the world, with the more data-driven approaches like the ones you find in deep learning?
Thank you. Yeah, so in my talk, I spoke about how we pre-train the model. So that incorporates some of the physical understanding into the neural network, but clearly it doesn't. So over time, it may learn that ice melts at a very particular temperature and turns to a gas at another particular temperature. But it would make sense to, to hard code that into the neural networks. So there are people far cleverer than me that can tell you how to do this, but it's something clearly we need to think about, and it touches on all our environmental sciences. So yes, this is something we are thinking about now, and I'm keen to reach out, and maybe as part of our special interest group that that's Gavin mentioned, we should have a session focused specifically on that question.
Great, thank you, Scott. Does anyone else? Yeah. Of course.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow on. I think it's a really good question. It actually brings up one of the kind of most important points about what we're trying to do, which is to actually engage with the kind of experts in the domain as well. So we're not just applying deep learning and AI to data sets with that and ignoring the kind of underlying physical constraints and the decades, if not longer, of knowledge about the underlying systems. And I think that's the kind of the next step, is to actually embed that knowledge into the deep learning and the other AI things, so that it's bringing together, in some ways, bringing together domain expertise from across domains through the integration of data and AI.
Great, thank you. Another great question comes from Anita Fowl. I like that because she connects it, she links this with a conversation that happened yesterday at AIUK. So Anita says, a talk yesterday highlighted the problem of static trained models that are not able to adjust to changes in the real world, which is very relevant, obviously, to the constant change in forests, in the climate. So how will your approach adjust to the changing world? And perhaps all our speakers can talk to that.
So I can start if you like, Irini. Maybe we're with an example from air pollution, where actually we see a discrepancy between measurements and models, certainly in China over the last kind of 3 or 4 years, where there have been great reductions in air pollution in certain areas, but the models that were trained were essentially didn't have those kind of built into them and those kind of starting parameters. And I think this is somewhere we're again integrating inverted commas live data or kind of quasi real-time data, and calibrating the models as we go along is something that can really help. So the models have been set and the underlying science is absolutely fine, but it's just the kind of inputs are kind of out of date, and we can use up data. And I think this kind of data fusion or post-processing is something that can really help. So we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but we're actually integrating across all the knowledge.
I think we can also integrate our climate physics-based models with AI approaches. A number of times the AI or the world may be doing something fairly routine, and the AI has seen that regime a number of times, and it can make a good prediction with a good uncertainty quantification. And then sometimes the climate does something we haven't seen before, and in that case we should be falling back onto our the physics, which is more expensive to run but is based on our understanding of physics. So we need to find ways to bridge these two different modeling worlds, and I think this hybrid approach could really be a powerful way to do that.
Mm-hmm. Emily, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I agree. We have some real specific problems of this in ecology, because we're seeing these novel combinations, and then because most of the species that we're modeling have not existed in this higher CO2 world. So we don't really know a lot about how, well, we're not able to predict how some of the sort of knock-on consequences of that. And I agree with what Gavin said. I think we need to be incorporating more information, and we also need to be challenging our model structures with that new data as it comes in, because our model structures are designed for what we think is going on, but it isn't necessarily true when our ecosystems are faced with these novel conditions.
Thank you. And I have a question for all of you. What do you think is the biggest thing holding us back from the application of AI for climate and environmental science? Like, what is the enabling environment that we need to build around those applications?
I'm going to fly the data pipeline flag again. We need improved data pipelines, easy access to data, reproducible data workflows, interpretable workflows. So many areas have been held back by just not having those key things in place.
I definitely agree. I also would flag skills, particularly within my field, where people are often trained in field methods, which we absolutely need, but we also need those other skills to come in. So we need more collaboration across disciplines.
Gavin, you're on mute.
I think data pipeline and skills are absolutely crucial, and I think with skills would be communication, the kind of ability for data scientists to talk to domain and environmental experts and vice versa. So I think engagement, communication, and that would come from kind of increasingly people from cross domains actually understanding what the challenges and the technical details are from both domains, and then bringing those together in the AI.
Great, thank you all. Maybe one last comment. I think we are just 1 minute after 10:30, so we need to wrap it up quickly. But a question for all of you: what new trend do you think we'll be talking about at next year's conference?
Physics-informed AI. That's my guesstimate.
Biology-informed AI.
process.
And I think maybe some of the, developing solutions, which at the moment, certainly the things I was talking about is providing decision makers with information to make decisions. Maybe the AI could start to help make those decisions and formulate different approaches as well.
Great. Thank you all. I'm afraid this is the end of our session. Thank you to our speakers, to our panel. Thank you to the organizing committee and for the audience for staying with us and sharing great questions. You can find more about our work on the Turing's website. If you search for climate action, you see lots of different projects there. You can contact our speakers directly. And you can also join the Sustainability and Environment Interest Group, which is convened by Gavin at the Turing. But yeah, thank you so much for being with us, and have a good rest of the day.